think we are live. So yeah, we got to see me walk in here. It's so weird. All right, so you guys get the behind the scenes here. So welcome everybody back here to another episode of Entrepreneur Struggle. We have another great conversation coming up. Before we jump into who we're talking to, before we jump into the actual conversation, just a reminder for those of you who may be new or those who might be coming back, Entrepreneur Struggle is a podcast and video series where we like to do the conversations and interviews live here, give you an opportunity to be able to take something away for your own personal journey. So we're talking to fellow entrepreneurs, fellow freelancers, people who are just owning their own brand, owning their life, and really making an impact in the world in the way that they really, see as the most effective way to go about the particular careers that they may be in, but really focusing on those mental and emotional challenges that it takes to create and scale up a company. And again, freelancing is like owning your own company. It is owning your own company. So if you see yourself as a freelancer, also see yourself as an entrepreneur and somebody you can take away from these conversations. So I encourage you, if you're watching this live, to be able to make comments here on YouTube. I got my computer right here where I can take some of your comments or questions. And yeah, we want you to be able to participate. If there are people that you think will take something away from this, make sure you recommend it. And also, if you're not able to listen to all this conversation, we will be putting this out as a podcast this coming Monday. I really should double check these things. I think Monday's August 1st. Is it?
I don't know. It seems like it's all like the days are blurring, man. I don't know.
I feel, yeah. So yeah, days kind of blurring together. I think it's August 1st. But anyway, this coming Monday, this episode will be coming out. So today I'm joined by a very special guest. Obviously, I just had her chime in. I probably should have introduced her first, but
no worries.
Here was Siri Chillara, and I really should ask you when you first came into. How do you pronounce your last name?
It's actually Chillara.
Chillara.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah. No, it's okay. All good.
Siri Chillara. She is the founder of Juice, and is it dot juice or juice?
So it's juice with a period at the end.
Oh, my fault. Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
My dot mixed up. So founder of Juice, period. Now, when you introduce your company, do you introduce it as Juice or is it Juice, period?
So I introduce it just as Juice.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, Siri here has created an incredible company really around health and wellness, especially for people who are on the go. And we're going to get into the definition of what it means to be a modern nomad, which I know is a lot of the basis for your company. But
totally.
She also has, like many of us as entrepreneurs, a very personal story to why you do what you do. And so I think a great place to start would be, give us a little bit of that journey that led to the creation of Juice.
Yeah, first off, thank you so much for having me here. Normally, I am usually the one on the other side of these sorts of conversations because we have a podcast too. So it's a really big privilege to be featured here and to speak to all of you about myself and what we're doing. I'm first gen, so my parents immigrated from India in the 90s. So they've been here for nearly 30 years. And I feel like the one thing that they always tried to emphasize for us was like, if you go and get educated, that is one way of breaking through like systemic oppression and for one way for you to like mobilize upward. And of course, like that was, said to us and they meant well, of course, but being in America and looking the way that I do, it's not just going to go get an education and, having this upward sort of mobility, but my sister and I, that's what we did. Stereotypically, like she went to go study medicine and I studied engineering. There was no, yeah, totally stereotypical. Like there was no pressure though. Like my parents were like, do what makes you happy. Like you're not starting from ground zero. Like we are that first generation. So like try to do what makes you happy. And so, I wanted to go out and save the world, save the environment. I had this like really bright eyed and bushy tailed sort of experience around wanting to help climate change and do all these things. But as I was kind of in that process, I just felt like there was so much, again, like beyond my control, what I could actually contribute. And so I was thinking like realistic ways of actually like improving climate change or working in general in public health. And so I was working for state government, I was doing local government, I was doing city government, I was working a little bit internationally, I was doing data science work. I was doing a lot of different aspects of like public health and climate change work. And kind of in that journey, I was also personally facing a lot of health problems. Like from childhood, I was a pretty like sickly kid. Everything I ate like made me sick. I was like constantly anxious. I was like having a lot of issues. And I think just being a woman, being brown and having immigrant parents, it wasn't necessarily the easiest to get the right type of healthcare or to even like know what to do. And so while I was like building this career around public health and around climate change and energy and environmental work, I was trying to navigate the healthcare system and figure out like why it was so hard and so challenging for me to figure out like what was wrong with me. And so I was working at a data science job, and around that time was when a lot of my like diagnoses, I found out that I had Lyme disease, kind of came to an apex. And I wasn't really having a good time in my work. I was like the only female engineer on my team, the only woman of color. And as I was having these health problems, I was like, look, like I feel like a lot of people who look like me experience challenges in healthcare. And then I feel like a lot of people who also look like me and maybe have some of my shared identities have a lot of issues with tech. So, can we possibly create a new paradigm where we're like building a healthy and inclusive technology ecosystem and at the same time possibly affect healthcare as well? So, it was like this two-pronged approach of like, it's not only that I believe that healthcare can be made to be more inclusive, but I also believe that we can make technology overall just a better place for all of us to work in and collaborate together in.
Nice. And yeah, it sounds like, you saw the problem within like what you were dealing with, and now it's like, okay, one, how can I help myself, and how
Yeah.
can I affect all these other people that are either going through this now or may end up going through this? I guess with that in mind, like, did you just specifically kind of focus on the issues that you were seeing, or did you start to kind of outsource and I guess not outsource is the wrong word, but start to talk to other people who look like you or have some of the same identities to understand like what are you facing?
Yeah, so I think like so as a co-founder team, so I have two other co-founders. One of them happens to be my sister. And so as a co-founder team, we had come up with this idea like randomly in 2018. We were grabbing beers at a brewery and we're just talking about like so we were coming from all over the place. So my sister at that time was in medical school. We were raised in Connecticut, so Connecticut was kind of like a commonplace. At that time I was also like coming back from the Middle East where I was doing some research. I'd taken some time off of school, and our third co-founder, who was a friend, was coming from like Philadelphia. So all of us were kind of gathering in Connecticut, and we were talking about like, hey, like I need a haircut, but I can't find anyone who cuts curly hair. It's so hard when you have textured hair to find people who are gonna like not just like cut it like this or straighten it and cut it, right? So initially the problem was like, all right, how do I go about finding someone who's gonna cut curly hair? And then our other co-founder was like, all right, like I actually need a massage. Like, how do I do that too? And so when we were like, it was an initial question of like, how do we find these services and how do we go about booking them? And we were like, all right, like the first place to go is like Google. And then you go down Google, then you go down to Yelp and you go like down all of these different rabbit holes to like figure out like these services. But then when you actually go about booking and paying, you have to like go through all of this like hogwash again to select your service, like do all this stuff. And so we just felt like the process of like finding like a problem that you have and then actually going to like getting to the point of actually being able to book and go about doing that sort of like health service or whatever it is, whether wellness or beauty, there's like so much time and so much like work involved in that that at the end of it you just like you're like fuck it, I'm just gonna not do anything. You know what I mean? Like it's taking me too long. I'm not trying to like go look at all these 5-star reviews. Like I don't need a haircut today. I don't need a massage. I'm good, you know? So I guess, like it was just that as a co-founder team, we had personally experienced these pain points. And then we kind of tabled the idea. We're like, all right, like, you know what? Like, we don't have the capacity to do anything about this. And then the pandemic started rolling around 2020. And my sister, so one of my co-founders, of course, she was a first responder in the emergency rooms. And so like around that time, we started noticing that like so many of us millennials and Gen Zs had been moving around and just shifting the way that we were like going about our lives. People weren't living where they worked. This like concept of like remote culture was like really becoming a big thing. But there was a massive friction point in how people actually went about accessing care. Emergency rooms were backed up, so were urgent cares. So people were like doing telehealth, people were doing all kinds of weird things to like figure out what to do if they couldn't go to the doctor.
Yeah.
And so this initial problem that we had in 2018 actually became like a massive problem, like or an opportunity in 2020, because that was like sort of this inflection point that opened up the stage for people to be like, all right, if like what I'm experiencing is clearly not urgent enough to go to the urgent care or to the hospital, like what am I supposed to do right now? Or like what am I supposed to do if I'm like my work is in New York but I'm like home in Connecticut visiting my parents for the weekend and I like need to take care of myself, you know? So I think like it went from this personal problem to something that we like noticed an opportunity in 2020. And then 2020 to 2021, like, of course, my sister was in medical school. Like me and my other co-founder were starting to just talk to a lot of people then and start to do a lot of research. And we talked to businesses who were holistic health clinics. We talked to so many different stakeholders in insurance and technology. And we're like, all right, is there actually a need for this? Or again, is this something that we're just seeing a problem in? And so I think through that personal experience, seeing the right opportunity, and then just talking to a lot of people like validated the sort of direction that we were heading in with the product.
That makes a lot of sense. And we're gonna pause for one quick second. My microphone's a little low, so
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
Oh,
I was
you're
just
perfectly
rambling on.
Oh no, you are perfectly
Okay,
fine.
okay, cool,
Actually,
cool, cool. Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
trying
yeah.
to figure out how I'm gonna handle this, but
Okay.
YouTube, those who are watching, give us 1 minute here as I
Okay, cool,
adjust
cool,
our
cool.
microphone. Technology isn't perfect. So hang on.
Hopefully that's better.
Hopefully that's better there. And hopefully you couldn't hear too much of my squeaky shoes. New shoe problems. But yeah, back to with Juice. So you founded it with your sister, which
Mhm.
We were talking a little bit earlier about like my first episode was with my sister, and
Yeah.
she's an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurialism has been really big in our family. Similar to what it sounds like in your family now
Totally.
as well. But we've seen personally that it can be really tough to work with families.
Mhm.
Like, what have been some of the benefits and maybe even challenges working with your sister on this project and literally founding it, not even just working together? You literally are both owners of this thing.
Yeah. So I feel like it's it's amazing, and at the same time it's a challenge, like you said, right? And I think the parts of it that are amazing is that like we are so mentally connected that when like some weird shit is going down, we like look at each other and we're like we both know what we're thinking. So like for instance, if we've like been in a meeting like with an investor who's straight up just like being racist or like saying something that's sexist, we kind of have that sort of like mutual understanding of like, okay, here's how we're going to handle this. And it like was never a situation in which I didn't feel like I couldn't trust her. It's like that so much trust exists in these co-founder relationships, you know? So I felt like having like a co-founder that was a family member, it was just so much innate trust in our process and what we were doing. And I think like it's also that we have so many shared experiences around being first gen and also being on opposite sides of the coin that I feel like it kind of our skill sets like and our sort of dynamics as being like family members really gelled really well with each other. And I think like points that are like, where there are conflicts, I think is like because when you're working with a family member, it's so close that sometimes you like don't keep your boundaries well. You know what I mean? You're like having a personal conversation like through text message, and then you're like, hey, like, did you hear about this from this guy? Or something like that, you know? And she's like, dude, it's literally 9 p.m. Like, why are you talking to me about work right now? Like, if you want to talk to me about work, like, why don't we do it this way, you know?
Yeah.
And so I feel like that was one of the biggest things and the biggest challenges that we had to kind of work through. Like, when do we have our work hats on? When do we have like our personal hats on? And also like we have different hats too. She's a doctor and I'm like also someone who's a patient, you know? It's like, so when is she also having her doctor cap on? Or when am I like someone who maybe needs like some medical support, that type of thing, you know? So I think it's on the whole created an environment where we can really be open and frank and honest and have like a trustworthy conversation and an environment with each other. And at the same time, I think we're constantly navigating how to like still protect ourselves and our time and our boundaries with each other so that we can keep those relationships like really positive and healthy.
How have you figured out maybe some of that communication stuff? Because I know I may not be in business with any of my family members, but my mother is an investor in the company, and so
Yeah.
like we can easily flip from a conversation about what's going on with the family to like, oh, how are things going? And I don't know if how things are going is I
Yeah.
need to give you a business update right now,
Yeah.
or if
Yeah.
I can just brag about something.
Yeah.
It's not gonna, we're not gonna have to dig into all the financials of what's happening. So yeah, how did you figure out how to balance that?
So one thing that I feel like is important to share is that I'm actually on the autism spectrum. So it's called ASD these days, but I guess like I where I sit is like Asperger's. And so I think like communication has always been a challenge and a gift and a lot of sort of sort of something that I've really had to work on over the years. And so one thing that's really interesting in the autism community that things that like folks who are kind of in this space like encourage is to use tags to like kind of dictate the tone or the sort of like messaging around something. So there's like certain like tags, there's just like it's like a hash and then it's like a J for joking. And so like what I realized though is that there are certain things that are kind of encouraged in the autism or ASD community that all of us can really rely on, like whether we're neurotypical or neurodiverse. So like similarly to that, if it's like, I think it's just being as clear as possible. It's like, hey, like, can we talk about work right now? And what hat are you wearing at the moment? And do you have capacity for this? You know, and like if it's like if it's something that if it's 9 p.m. and you need to send like a message to someone who's your family member, sometimes I've been like hashtag like hashtag S for serious. So like this is something that like needs attention. If it's like something quick and I'm like, hey, can I get on a phone call with you because I really need to talk about this? It's kind of, making sure that the communication is really, really clear and the intention is like really clear so that the other person is like hyper aware to like what you need in that moment and what you're asking for as well. And I think that also gets back to like this place of boundary setting, because I think the more clear you are with your communication around your needs and the more clear you are about like in what way you're also saying it, because so much gets lost in like text messages and emails and even like verbal conversations sometimes. I think like the better you can go about just like creating healthy boundaries in relationships too. So I think for me, it's just like been really important to just be explicit, you're my family member, but right now I need this from you right now. And it's serious and like ASAP.
And yeah, that slash that you're putting in, is that before the message? Like you're basically keying them into like what part of your brain are you going to use for this conversation?
Yeah. I do that with family members. I do that with friends. I do that with like a lot of different folks. And I come like I introduce it by saying like, hey, like this is I'm on the autism spectrum, and this is kind of like a tool that I've like found that sometimes helps me kind of keep communication really clear with people. Like, would you be comfortable if I shared what this was about, and you could decide if like you wanted to partake in this too,
I
type of
love
thing.
that. I'm definitely stealing that because yeah,
Yeah, please. Yeah.
and I also like how you framed it too of asking like, what do you have the capacity for? Because there's so many times that even my own team members or whether it be family members too, they'll ask me questions, and I just mentally am just burned out. I
Yeah.
can't. As simple as the question may be, if it's business
Totally.
oriented, my brain is just on shutdown. I
Yeah.
can't. It's gonna make me angry even trying to think
Yeah.
about an answer
Just
for it.
hashtag N. No.
Yeah, exactly. But like being as intentional with it,
Yeah,
like you
yeah.
just said, I think lowers that barrier to not have to feel like I have to answer it in that moment. If
Exactly.
we're asking each other, do you have the capacity for it? It's not saying that I can't answer you, I don't want to answer you. Just in this particular moment, I don't have what it needs to give you a clear response. So let me
Exactly.
follow through.
Yeah. And I think the thing is like, brain scans have shown us over the years that all of us are a little bit neurodivergent in our own ways. All of our brains are a little bit different. And I think like that just translates to like all of our experiences, all of our communication, all of our needs also being a little bit different. And I feel like we all kind of attach like the same patterns, even when we don't necessarily get the same outcomes. So if we want like a different outcome, maybe it means that we like change the way that we kind of set our pattern and the way that we like approach things. So I feel like it's been really positive for me to have this sort of interaction with people where I'm just like very explicit and clear. And then I think like it creates also just like that also returns to you, because then people start like to speak to you that way, where they're like, hey, like can I bother you about this? Like, is this okay? Like, this is how serious I am. This is the level of urgency. And it like really cuts down on time, like helps your mental health, and just like lets people know like how you're feeling and like what you need and like what the next move is.
Yeah. And you also mentioned too, like, you mentioned, and also we can see like you're a part of many different marginalized identities. As a
Yeah.
woman, as someone in the disabled community, as someone who's a person of color, we haven't even touched on. I think you're also part of the LGBTQ plus
Yeah.
community. Like literally, when people ask me what DCP stands for, and like the communities we speak to, literally it's every single one of those identities that that you're a part of. So you were talking too before about in the engineering and like your earlier career before you became a CEO, you were
Hmm.
running into a lot of problems of being part of those marginalized communities and how you're perceived and how people treated you. Jumping in now as an entrepreneur, did you face some of those same challenges? And how did you try to work through those?
So yeah, I almost think that it's a little bit harder jumping into the startup and venture space, because I think there's like a level of like, if you say something, it's like, all right, what's the evidence? And like, I don't believe you. I think like there is that challenge when you're young and you have these like marginalized identities, because so for instance, like I always bring up this sort of paradigm to kind of show what I feel like the difference is in like the venture and startup space. So for instance, like as I've mentioned like so many times, one of my co-founders is a doctor, but we have gone into like these investor rooms or like these stakeholder meetings where she says something as a physician, and like some like white dude who has like a communications degree from like not even the caliber of the schools that she's gone to feels like he has like the authority to be like, well, like that's not how medicine works, and like this is like the way that blood pressure medication is like put out, so like how are you gonna like put that into like an EMR and then make like it's like stuff that doesn't even make sense. So that's the example that I show of like someone who's very credentialed and like knows what they're doing, and in an environment like where we're going to these meetings, people are like, well, I don't believe you. It's like, well, I have a degree. It's like, I don't believe you. You need to show me this other evidence, or you need to do this, or you need to do that. And I think like part of that process is good, right? Like when you're seeking invest in funds, when you're trying to get like funded and you maybe don't have a lot of credibility behind your first time founder, I can understand the robustness of some of this process, but I think like it's undeniable that like systemic oppression like is seeping throughout like the startup and entrepreneurial space. Like HBS did a study I think in like 2016 that showed that when investors speak to men, they speak about ventures in the sense of opportunity, but when they speak to women, they speak about it in terms of risk. And so that is like contributing to why women get only less than 2% of the funding. And then if you look at trans women or black women or Asian women or any intersection of that, it's of course way less. And so I think like, yeah, for sure, I've experienced a lot of like issues in the startup and entrepreneurial space. And I think this was definitely, shit that I experienced in all aspects of like my degrees, getting my degree, my work experience. And I think like what I've really had to do is kind of take a look inside, because I think like sometimes you don't even realize that a lot of this oppression is also rooted in you because of the systems that we are raised in, right? So like I could have a lot of internalized oppression within me. Like I could be racist, I could be sexist, I could be all of these things inside. And I think it's taking a look inside and seeing what sort of work do I have to do so that I then don't have to like propagate this harm on other people, and I can actually do a job of like recognizing like what is harm and what is white supremacy and what is actually like the mission that's like that I'm working towards with my business. So the first thing that like I did and like my company did is that we got some training and we started aligning with groups that were actually teaching us about anti-racism, teaching us about accountability in the workplace, teaching us about change management and what that actually looks like, helping us put together a harm and reparation policy. And that group is called MMG, and their CEO Mackenzie is now our official advisor. And so that was the first thing that we did. We're like, all right, we might be like Indian American, we might be like first gen, we might have all these identities, but it doesn't mean that we can't pull this bullshit on other people the way that we have been harmed. And I think the thing after that is to like really develop like a sort of toolkit for how you manage this type of harm or how you manage this type of oppression. So like once you've been dealt this harm, like what do you do after to kind of like rest and repair and to like tether yourself to your mission again? So I think I was speaking to a founder who gave me like some really good tips on this, which I've started to do is anytime like you experience any type of hate or someone saying something really negative to you, I think it's like you can process it. And then I think you can also like coach yourself in the moment. So like there's on my phone, I have a folder that's like all of the wins. You know what I mean? Everything that I've done that's been like sick, like, or anything that's happened that's been positive, I kind of go back in that folder and remind myself. It's like, you know what? Like maybe this thing went badly. Maybe someone treated you badly. Maybe like, someone was racist or sexist towards you, but like here's ways in which you've like broke past that and actually like did something that impacted someone in a positive way. And I think like reminding yourself, like when all of this shit is going on the outside, who you are and what your values are and why you're doing what you're doing, I think like can literally like move mountains. And like that I feel like is, what I've experienced, what we've experienced as a team and how we've tried to move past it.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and I think even what you mentioned is good, just in as a general practice in terms of like keeping this list of accolades for yourself to fall back on. Because I think a lot of times as entrepreneurs, and this is definitely me projecting, like we're so focused on what hasn't worked and how we can
Yeah.
improve and what are the next things we're going to do. Even if we get a win, we might celebrate it for a few hours, maybe even a day, but then it's
Yeah.
moving on to the next thing. And so
Yeah.
I think even making that list can also just be self reassuring and almost preventative care for yourself.
Totally. And like our advisor, Mackenzie, says all the time, like when you're faced with something, ask yourself, like, what is this trying to distract me from? And like a lot of the work that we do, like, especially in healthcare, is like dismantling white supremacy and systems of oppression. So they always say to me, like, like, what is this actually trying to distract you from? Like, what is the actual problem here? Like, is someone just trying to, it's kind of like in startups or venture, it's like, we shouldn't be competing with each other for funds, right? We should realize that there's an abundance, and it's like women of color are forced to like compete with each other to get this funding when really it's about like the wealth is already there and figuring out how to distribute it to people who look like us.
Yeah.
So I think it's like it's not that there's less funding, so that's just a distraction. It's like different systems are at play to make sure that like we don't get the opportunities that maybe we should.
Yeah, because right now you're just getting a small carve out of the investment money that's out there. Like if we just increase that pie for increase the slice, then
Yeah, yeah,
we're not competing against each other, and or we're creating more opportunities for others.
exactly, yeah.
With what you were saying too, which I really loved, of like how you all approach just as a business. Yes, we are part of these marginalized communities, but we're going to take the responsibility ourselves to learn and better understand how we don't fall into the same bucket what that approach also does, which I don't know if this is particularly why you do it, but I think it's beneficial, is it now gives you examples to point to if you're speaking to other companies about how they need to improve. Well, we have done X, Y, and Z. We have seen how this has really benefited us in terms of being responsible, but also maybe has other benefits that you can now use to push these other companies. You know, maybe it's opened up new relationships to do business, or maybe it's opened up new kind of contracts you can go after, or what have you. And so now you can speak from a place of personal experience when you're trying to educate, say, white male
Yeah.
companies to do something similar to you, and again to take better care of the marginalized communities that might be part of their clients or part of their network.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people think that DE&I and like the change management industry in general is not important, I think they're like making a huge economic, like a huge societal, like so many mistakes there. You know what I mean? It's like it's you can be value driven and mission based and also be someone who makes money. You know what I mean? Like so many millennials and Gen Zs especially care about social issues. Like I'm on that cusp of being a millennial and Gen Z, and like we care about inclusivity. We care about rallying for issues that affect us because we have literally been given like the shitstorm of things that we now have to fix to like save the planet and to move forward, you know? And so I think that if companies like don't realize that like having inclusive practices or getting trained, if they don't think that that's important, then I think they're shutting themselves off to a whole demographic that has so much spending power now.
Yeah.
And I think it's also that it has worked in our favor in the sense of like we have these values, we have this training, we have these like sort of values that we hold ourselves to. And like it makes investors, it makes like customers, it makes people then actually want to support us because they see that we are like putting in that work, you know? And I think it's also like, I think it's one way to also say, like, if a company our size, so small, can spend the money and take the time to do something like this, some big corporation doesn't need to have like their one black person like run the DEI and training forever. You know what I mean? It's like if like we can, yeah, yeah, it's like we can do it. Like at our size, like literally any corporation beyond that should be able to like find a budget and like should be able to find resources to like really prioritize this work.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier too, like a specific kind of example of your sister being a doctor, someone who's in the
Yeah.
doctor field, explaining doctor type of things, and then obviously someone who has no qualification,
Yeah.
just because they are a man, and very much probably feel like she's not qualified to speak on
Mm-hmm.
what she's speaking on, to shut that down. In those kind of situations, or maybe even in that specific situation, like how do you address that in the moment, or do you address that in the moment?
Yeah, great question. So, in the past, I wouldn't. I would kind of just like kind of freeze up and like not be sure of what to do because I think I was really scared of saying anything. And I was really scared about the repercussions because the industry is like very small. Like, as I'm sure you have experienced yourself, like if you meet one founder, it's almost as if that founder knows this other founder and that founder knows some investor who then knows you too. And so the community is really small. And I think when you have more of a marginalized identity, you're always afraid of like, okay, who am I going to tick off? And then how are they then going to like come after me and my business and maybe talk shit about me and make it harder for me to succeed, you know? And so I think in the beginning I didn't say anything, but like there was this one instance where like we were pitching to a pretty big venture fund and they just like kept interrupting and hurling questions, hurling questions, hurling questions. And I literally was like, excuse me, folks, like we're going to stop this right now. So like I like was literally like I was off camera. I was like gripping myself. I was like, girl, you got to do this. Else like they're going to keep walking over you. And I just like put my foot down. I was like, excuse me, like we're not going to do this anymore. You keep interrupting and speaking over us and you're being incredibly disrespectful. And like we have given you our time, so we expect the same from you. And I feel like that was the first time that I really stepped into my power and I said something and they like listened. And then they like were cowering because I feel like in a lot of like, I'm sorry to say this, like, you know, for folks who are white and in power, it's like they can give it out, but then when you give it back to them as a person of color or minority, they can't always take it to their face, you know? It's kind of just like, oh, you spoke back to me? Like, what? You actually said something back to me, you know? And so like as a co-founder team, like me, Nidhi, like Sid, like we are being more firm about like what is okay and what isn't. And in the moment, it's just like calling it out, being like, hey, like that made me uncomfortable. Or like, hey, like, why did you do that? Hey, could you explain your rationale there? You know, like the other day I was like pitching like an angel investor who recorded my pitch, you know, without my consent, like
Oh
things like
wow.
that, you know,
Okay.
that it's like really common in this sort of space. So I think calling out that behavior and being like, hey, that was really inappropriate. Or like, hey, like, please don't ask for my like personal phone number, like if you're not my friend, or you know what I mean? So I think calling out that behavior as it is in a way that's like respectful and courteous, but honors your own boundary is like the only way thing that you can do unless you like really are in a place where people are just then walking over you, you know?
does those like kind of marginalized identities, because obviously we're talking a lot about like the investor side, but
Yeah,
even as a public facing company, I think a lot of times, as a person of color, like I feel like I sometimes have to be very careful about what I say and how I say it,
totally.
whether it be about my community or just about things that are happening in the world. Like with those identities that you come from, and
Hmm.
also now your business, very much trying to make an impact. Is there fear, or how do you manage? How do you speak publicly? How do you utilize your voice in social media or marketing space?
Yeah, so most recently, like of course we all experienced and heard about the overturn of Roe, right? And so that was something like really major for us when we were thinking about like should we say something or not? Should we say something or not? Because I think there are a lot of like social issues that come up, and like I feel like companies are then in this place where they're like, "Oh, I'm going to be woke by like talking about I'm going to be like, yes, Black Lives Matter, Blackout Tuesday, like all of this stuff, you know?" And it's like, "All right, like you can say that, but what are you actually doing, right?" And so exactly. So when it came to Roe, like and anytime we put like anything out that's like medical or health or wellness related, I always like check in with Nidhi because, as a doctor and as someone who's really providing us a lot of that medical backbone, we need to make sure that the stuff that we're putting out is like medically accurate and is also put out in a way that's like also sensitive to the sorts of ways that people might be interacting with the news, interacting with things that are going on. We don't want to deplete someone's like mental wellness or make them feel worse by our content or make them feel worse in a way of like, why is this brand now like capitalizing on this like terrible thing that's happening, you know? So I think like for Roe, especially, we had to like think about like, what do we actually want to do and how do we actually want to say this? Because like the ability for everyone to have access to healthcare is something that like is so personally tied to our mission and our values. So like we came out like Roe happened, and then we came out like really, really strong and put out like an equity pledge, which basically said that every single stakeholder that we work with needs to basically believe in this like value of diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And we opened it up to like founders, technologists, operators, and people in venture. And so that to us wasn't something that we were doing to like, I don't know, look cool or to have like clout. It was more so that like if we want to actually make healthcare more inclusive, we need to actually take a stance on like what this means, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think for us it's been about like what are things that are in our control? What are things that like are in our values, and what are things that are actually, you know, how can we actually address things in a way that are also sensitive? And so I think like thinking about all of those things is like, I don't think there's any pattern or rule book. I think we kind of like go off of like just how we feel, contextualize that what in like a way of if it's appropriate to say something, and then figure out like the best way to say it in like and really being thoughtful about what it is that we're doing, you know?
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, there's never, I guess, a perfect way to say what you want to say. But at
Yeah.
the end of the day, as long as you are, taking into consideration the community that you're speaking to, obviously a lot of the community you're speaking to, especially around Roe v. Wade, is very much yourself.
Yeah.
It's great when you're able to speak kind of, to your own truth, but at the same time, just understanding the language that you use, like, can really have a real impact. So
Yeah.
I think like a lot of times people make those knee jerk reactions, like you said, to do the blackout square, to do
Yeah.
this, and it's like, well, then when you find out, like, well, doing a blackout square doesn't help anything. Like,
Yeah.
what did that actually accomplish? So let's really
Exactly.
think through. Okay, this is now going to lead to this, or if I'm going to raise attention that we're doing this, is this going to draw attention to maybe some other way that we're having an impact, or another way that we're, maybe pushing people to a company that might be doing more.
Yeah, and I think like in the beginning we were just like so afraid of being more vocal, like whether it was like in an investment room, whether it was like with customers that were, when we were like, trying to figure out what type of customer we wanted to actually provide our product to on the business side because we're a marketplace. There were some interactions that were like really negative and really racist too, And so I think like a lot of and we had to be so careful, as you said, like when you're black or brown or a person of color or underrepresented, it's like every single word that you said is like that you say is put under a microscope and examined and then like ripped apart and then thrown back in your face of like, this is now how I'm going to like put you down and make it such that you can't like move out of this. And so I feel like we were so like bent up on all of that that it was almost like paralyzing. And we're like, okay, like what can we do as a company? And then I think, the more that I like tried to figure out like how we could be true to ourselves and the more that I was vocal and like spoke about these issues, I feel like then we started connecting with like the people that actually like really believed and like saw what we were doing. So I think there's like power in like laying low and like really focusing like inwards and like maybe in a more stealth sort of place. I think like that has some power. And then there's also a lot of power in just like saying, you know what, like screw it, I'm just gonna be me, because whether I'm not, I am me. These are still the systems in place. And like, this is it. I gotta just like be true to myself, else I like can't make a difference here.
Well, for a mission-driven company like yourself, like I think it's even more important.
Yeah,
You're saying with millennials and Gen Z, especially, like they are looking to make sure that the companies that they're supporting are truly about what they say they're about. They really are trying
totally.
to make an impact, and so
Gen Z will like find the source and like literally like I don't know, just really, expose brands and people that are like just talking shit, and like literally not doing anything. And
yeah, they will rip
especially,
your
yeah,
teeth.
they will they will rip you apart, and deservedly, like it's if they're gonna spend their dollars, like Gen Z is very intense about the way that like they spend their funds. I was reading the stat that like 14% of Gen Zs are now putting their like or Gen Zs are putting 14% of their like saving their like income into savings and like really being good about like diversifying the way that they're spending and like allocating a lot of their funds to small businesses because like I guess no one trusts the government anymore. So there's a lot of like people talk about like, oh, this generation is so bad or like they don't do things, but it's like I feel like Gen Z is like the generation's gonna save everybody, you know what I mean, or at least like really make us reconcile as a society with like what we've really done.
Yeah, no, I think every generation helps to reevaluate a better way of doing things.
Yeah.
There's so many things that are going wrong that
Yeah.
hence why Gen Z is helping in many different ways. But I think
Yeah, 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 yeah.
you mentioned too, like what we talked a little bit about earlier, investing and how difficult that can be, especially as part of these marginalized communities. But when you do come up against those for whatever
Hmm.
given reason, or maybe sometimes you don't know the reason, like how do you bounce back from those? Especially maybe sometimes thinking in the back of your head of, oh, maybe it's because I'm part of a certain identity, or because they don't truly understand what we're trying to accomplish. Like, how do you push through that and continue to stay motivated to then reach out to others?
So I feel like for me personally, like I feel like I try to be really self-aware again of my own limitations as someone who's on the autism spectrum. So I feel like there might be one way that I'm perceiving things, but then I've like started to build kind of a supportive community of people that I can really rely on to help me navigate these situations. So for instance, if I get like a big piece of feedback from an investor that's like basically sandwiching a no, I kind of take it to like my community members and be like, "Hey, like is this legit feedback or is this just like hog like bullshit?"
Yeah.
And so in situations like that, they're like, okay, like this is actually like bullshit. And this is probably because they don't believe that you can do this. You know, like I think like we've been coached so much and have been put through so many different like programs and accelerators that I feel like the no's kind of roll off. So I think it's like for me, I like read or look at a no and I'm like, all right, is the reason because there's something actually wrong with like what we're doing or approach? Or they experience some sort of risk there? Or is the language just being boiled down to like we know that this is a problem that you're trying to solve, but we don't think you're the team to do it. And if it's like we don't think you're the team to do it, then we go back and analyze like, okay, what is it? Like, what is it about the team? Is it that we're really young and maybe don't have a lot of experience? All right, like that's something that we can't help. Like, I can't help that. Is it that maybe like I don't know, like, so I feel
There's
like,
not enough
yeah,
performance, maybe again, something you can't necessarily
exactly.
help if they're
Yeah.
going
And
through it.
then but then I think about then when we go back, it's like, all right, we have like one co-founder who literally worked at like Point 72 Asset Management, like built financial like tools, using software. We have one who's literally a physician, and then we have one who's like a chemical engineer, like and a patient who's like worked on high level projects too. So it's like I think like you take this feedback and you kind of filter it and be like, all right, like what are they actually saying here? And then kind of figuring out for yourself, like, is this viable feedback? Or again, is this just something that like they just don't believe in you? And I think the thing is, it's like, even if people don't like believe in you at that moment, those opinions can change when they start seeing those financial returns, right?
Yeah.
So as soon as they start seeing that you're making money or you're actually executing on what they thought that like you couldn't do, then they come back and it's like, okay, like actually now I see this and like I might still not believe in you or might not think that you can do this, but like because I'm seeing the money, like that's what I kind of care about. So I think it's just like, just figuring out for yourself, like again, where your boundaries are, like what you sense and kind of like believing in yourself, but also surrounding yourself with enough of a community to help you like to help guide you through these like tricky situations too.
Yeah, like yeah, having that training I think obviously helps. Now you just know like, all right, well we know our worth and we understand like how to present, and so it's not
Yeah.
always necessarily
It's
about
hard though.
sometimes
Like,
them.
yeah. I'm
But
talking a big game. I mean, like back in the day, like I would get some of these emails. I'd be like, oh my God, like the business is gonna fail. Like we can't do this. And like, hey, like we're here and we're growing and things are okay. So I think like that resilience is really a muscle.
yeah.
How has that been in your experience? Like,
Oh no, well. The other thing I was going to say, what you said, which has been beneficial for me, is yeah, having that community that you can bounce
yeah,
things off of to say like, okay, here's the message I got back. Like to you, what is that? Because I
yeah,
am very much inside So the
Exactly.
way I'm seeing it I may not be thinking of all the angles here. So
Totally.
for me, yeah, that has been helpful because I have family members who are also entrepreneurs and have
Yeah,
similar investment. I have a lot of friends, and that's part of starting this is because I have so many friends who are entrepreneurs or freelancers
totally.
or people trying to get money in for some kind of thing that they're creating. So it's also good knowing how many other other entrepreneurs have been turned down so often. So
Exactly.
like when you
Yeah.
know that you're not the only one getting
Hmm.
no's, it makes it that much easier to take. Where again, you can say, okay, well, this one didn't work out. What lessons can I learn going into the next one?
Yeah, there's like an investor that who's kind of like a mentor for us, and he was like, all right, like for if like for a white male company it takes them like 100 no's to get like one yes, for you guys it's going to take you like 300. So he always like checks in. He's like, all right, how far are you down? Like where are you in like the sort of like segmenting? Are you a third of the way there, two-thirds? Like where is your, you know
I
what I
like
mean?
that.
So it's kind of just like it's interesting, and like all of this community that like we've really built around us is all first gen and immigrant and people of color. And so like I think it's like also the shared experiences and the feelings around that. You know, it's kind of like the scarcity mindset, the sort of like you don't want to disappoint your parents and all of the stuff, and like really feeds into the sort of like support systems and community that we provide for each other, you know. So we're really able to be like, all right, man, like maybe this didn't work out, but it doesn't mean that like you ups like that you like you know, like lost your parents' dream or something like that. Just like relax. It's gonna be just fine, you know?
Sticking on money, I think it was on your social media, maybe
Hmm.
the company's social media.
Yeah.
Like you guys had a little hiccup with like a payroll service you were using at one point. Like, as much as you're allowed to tell or want to tell, like what happened in that situation, and then like what was some of the concerns you had? Because without knowing the context yet, I'm
Yeah.
thinking like automatically, I read them. Oh my god, like how is she going to pay her team? Like that must have been so stressful.
Yeah, it wasn't even that. It was actually that like we had hired someone, and like we couldn't, with that payroll company, we couldn't like get them health insurance until like 2 months after they joined.
Oh wow.
Even though I started the process for like trying to like get that set up like months before that. So the start date was like July of last year, and I was starting like the process of getting these benefits from May. And they were like, okay, like we can make this work for like when this person starts. And then like as we're inching closer to that, I'm like, hey, I haven't received any information about this. And they're like, oh, actually, like we can only do this like closer to September because like you missed this deadline. And I was like, I literally have the paper trail here, you know? So, you know, I'm not going to say who this company is because they're a startup too, and they're really big, like they're really well funded. And like, you know, I don't want to, you know, talk shit about a fellow startup because people are still figuring out their own stuff, you know? And at the same time, I feel like it was just like messed up that there was like absolutely like no control that I had over that situation. It was either that like we find someone, a different payroll company or a different benefits provider, or basically like this person doesn't get their health insurance. And it's like, again, if we're like a company that's wanting to, you know, foster this environment of providing benefits and health insurance for people, it's like really inappropriate for like someone to start at your team, like for a healthcare company, and literally have no benefits and be like, when am I going to get this, you know?
Yep. And whether that was really the payrolls, we can tell like that was their problem. The payroll service had messed it up. But like your employee, they're looking at you, and
Yeah. And they're
if you
like,
were to go
dude,
talk to media or for whatever reason, like now
yeah.
you as a brand look irresponsible and not about what you say you're about, and that can really tank your entire company right out of the gate just with that alone.
Exactly. And I think like, you know, especially when people are coming from a more like corporate environment where processes are already set up, like you talk to some person from HR and they're like, oh, you're going to get your health insurance from this day. But I think why startups are sometimes so notorious is that you're basically like building the airplane while you're flying it type of thing.
Yeah.
But you don't want to look like uncouth and unprofessional. And I think at the same time, and maybe you've experienced this too, but I think when you're a minority or a person of color, like the standards that you're held to are like ridiculously high.
Oh,
So like you cannot even make like one mistake without like even your own community members being like, that's crazy, man. Like, what are you doing? Like, what is this junk startup that you have that can't even get someone like their benefits, you know?
yeah.
So I think like maybe this situation that we were in would have been passable if we were like white bros that were like, hey man, like look, like we can't get this set up for you right now, but maybe in like 2 months, you know? But we couldn't do that. And we knew that like to retain this person and like to pay people and to like give people health insurance, like we needed to really like figure that out stat.
Yeah, we're like you. We have used a third, as many startups do. Like we have a third party HR company. We actually and payroll company. And the first one we were with, kind of a similar situation.
Yeah.
They messed up basically our maternity leave situation, and like they weren't getting our person wasn't gonna get benefits, and now they're already gone. And like I thought everything was
And it
set up.
reflects like literally on you and
Yeah,
not even on them. They're
yeah,
like, Chris, like what?
yeah. It's like I triple checked, and I told them, hey, I triple checked. Everything's gonna be fine. You're not worried
Yeah.
about anything. And then all of a sudden, all the problems arise,
Oh my
and
gosh.
like you don't want to. Still, the onus is on you.
Exactly.
But at the same
Yeah.
time, it looks like you So he ended
Totally.
up moving companies too. So that's where again, I saw that okay. Part of why I love doing the show. It's refreshing to see other entrepreneurs going through some of
Totally.
these
Oh my
same
gosh.
struggles.
Just like the tiny little, it's like, do I focus on building my company or fixing like those little annoying operations things? But if you don't do that thing, then you have no business, you know?
Everything.
Yeah, you have no ops, you have no people, you know?
Yeah. Well, we're kind of coming towards the end here, but
Great.
I kind of teased earlier that
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about this term modern nomad.
Mm-hmm.
Like your company is very much based around really helping provide health benefits and health care resources for people who are modern nomads. So
Yeah.
what does that mean, and how does your company really attack that?
So modern nomad for us is kind of like a person who's kind of in this like Gen Z to millennial demographic. And it's really modeled after like the what we saw from the pandemic, right? Like the pandemic caused these like two major trends: great migration, great resignation. The people most affected by that were millennials and Gen Zs. And so kind of spurring out of this like change in the day-to-day mobility experienced by these people, we're like, how do we actually like capture who this market is and who they are? And so that's how we kind of like spun out this term of a modern nomad, someone who's kind of in this demographic, who has a little bit of disposable income, who someone who's been maybe working for a few years, like, so not teenagers, right? But like kind of like 20, 25, like and maybe like 45, like 50, sort of like in that age range. And then kind of like also capturing the sort of like the modern aspect, which is that you can live in one place, your work can be in one place, your family can be somewhere else. You could be traveling like either across the country or even from borough to borough. Like if I were to, like, I live in Brooklyn, if I need healthcare, like I'm still Googling on my phone if I'm in Manhattan. It's not like I know the borough like necessarily better than I know Brooklyn. Like, and so I think just capturing the newness around the way that people are now living as opposed to maybe like 5 to 10 years ago, I think that's how we tried to capture like this kind of shift in the trend. And I think like, and one thing to address here is that we had actually a few customers like earlier in our journey that were like, hey, like I feel like this term modern nomad is like making a brand out to be something that encourages gentrification, because you're saying that like it's only for this group that is like traveling and moving. And we don't want to support a brand where like people are like, you encouraging people to like move to places where like gentrification is also such a huge problem. And that goes back to show that like again, Gen Z's and like millennials, we care so much about like every single thing that like a brand is really saying. And so I feel like we needed to really clarify that like even the word nomad has like had really negative and like racist connotations in the past, but part of us like talking about it in this way of like someone who's really reimagining what their day-to-day mobility looks like is kind of like reclaiming what that means for like kind of this place that we are in, like in history, you know?
It's interesting. I never thought about it having a negative connotation until I read, you all saying that on the website.
Yeah.
I always actually use it as a way. I'm polyamorous in my relationships,
Yeah.
and so like I use the fact that as human beings we were nomads early in life.
Yeah.
So I actually think of it more as a positive thing. Like that's who we are as human beings, are nomads. We've just fell into this civilization, like settled down in one place. But I think
Totally.
we're slowly, if not kind of now quickly,
Yeah.
kind of reversing course and becoming a little bit more nomadic, especially with those younger generations. So it was surprising to hear that
Yeah.
people might equate that around gentrification, because if anything, I felt like that actually is helping against gentrification, because now you can live wherever and
Mm-hmm.
still maybe get a good paying job.
Totally.
Your cost of living, and now you can make a $50,000 salary, where here in New York that's going to get you nothing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
$50,000 a year. But if I move to the middle of America somewhere, this is not shitting on middle of
Yeah.
America,
Yeah.
cost of living,
Totally.
but
Yeah.
like I can have a very comfortable lifestyle. So
Yeah.
like I think of being a nomad as a positive thing, because you fully have choice over your own life.
Yeah. And that's how we see our brand. That's how we see like even these wellness recommendations that we're pairing with people, like ultimately giving people choice and like this self-efficacy to really like think and have like autonomy over what they want to do and how they want to approach their well-being, especially like when they're on the go and really like again like reimagining the way that they're living and like being and thriving and being in community with each other.
Well, before we fully wrap up, I
Mhm.
want to give an opportunity. Like, you all have been doing such incredible stuff. Like, what are some of the big wins that you're celebrating right now, or maybe some that are coming up that you're allowed to talk about?
Yeah, so let's see. So I actually was accepted into Launch House. Launch House is a huge like community that, they recently raised their Series A with Andreessen Horowitz. They basically create like a community for founders across like the world to kind of kind of build their startups in an actual house together, kind of like a hack house, like, you know, what existed with like Airbnb and a lot of these companies. So they launched their second ever female cohort and I was accepted. So that is like a really big win for us. A few weeks ago, we processed our first transaction with a New York City business. And the charge was like over $1,000, you know, because folks were buying like a huge package of services. For people who are listening who don't know, we're like a B2B2C marketplace. So we work with businesses, we give them like a business software to run their day to day. And then we work with our customers to actually help them book and pay for these services and are eventually going to be, you know, providing these sort of wellness recommendations. And to see that someone like transacted such a high like cost item like that was like insane for us. You know what I mean? And so I think it was just a win for us to see that like this product that we had literally built from scratch in our hands, like our baby was like, you know, now supporting businesses like in Brooklyn and the Bronx, you know? And like that growth that we've been experiencing, like people who are really tied to our mission, our values as business owners, like choosing to be like, hey, like I'm stepping away from this like huge platform like Square. Like people like we have customers who have come from like Square who are now using Juice to manage their business. And like no matter what happens in this business, like no matter what happens in Juice, like, you know, that is like a huge win for us as a team, for us as engineers, technologists, and we're really proud of that.
No, you should be proud of that. Again, to be on the level of some of a company that is all, that is well
Poaching off,
recognized
like,
around
yeah,
the world.
yeah,
That is really incredible.
yeah.
Congratulations
Thank
on
you
that.
so
I'm
much.
sure there's a lot more wins coming.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
Fingers
a
crossed.
lot of times these things are a snowball effect. You get one big deal
Mm-hmm.
or two big things that you can really hang your hat on, and then they really just start coming after that. So hopefully that's the trajectory all
Yeah,
along.
fingers crossed, man. Fingers crossed.
And also, too, like I think another win for you all is the podcast you're doing. Like you have incredible conversations with other entrepreneurs and people making real impact in the world. So can you talk a little bit about the podcast as well?
Yeah, so our podcast is called Chai Not Chai Latte. And it started off as like a social media project because me and my sister, again, like pre-juice, we're like, all right, like where are the stories for like again, first gen immigrant founders? Like where are the stories, like our experiences, you know? And like that was I think at the advent of the concept of a chai latte. Like you would go to Starbucks and be like, oh, I want a chai latte. But it's like in any East Asian or Asian language, like chai literally just means like tea. It's cha or it's chai, and it just translates to tea. So if you're saying like tea, when you're saying like an iced chai latte or a chai tea latte, like it's tea latte, you know, it doesn't make sense, you know? And so we just thought, all right, like why don't we just address this on its head and make like a joke out of it? So that's why we named like this project Chai Not Chai Latte. And we specifically try to focus on underrepresented folks, like whether they're in the early stages of building their businesses or folks who have actually like exited or like are have more of like a global presence. And so one like really exciting like guest for us was the team from India Rising, who I'll give a shout out to. Like they're, you know, building a media platform for brown ballers everywhere. They just had their debut as a basketball team on the basketball tournament on ESPN. They didn't win because they played literally the team that won the $1 million last year, which is a Syracuse
Okay.
team.
Yep.
So it's like, how could they have like, yeah, yeah,
All those guys.
yeah, so that was literally their first game, so they didn't make it, but I think it was really cool to be able to like talk to folks who are working at the NBA and are, you know, like part of this brand who are trying to create like a platform for just Indian origin basketball players, which is like never a concept that I ever heard about. Like the only Asian representation I ever knew about was like Jeremy Lin and like you know, like beyond that, I'd never seen like a brown baller. So having people like that who are really like who are big change makers and trying to be disruptive at whatever scale, I think has like, it's crazy to me looking back that we've had some of these guests on the show on like such a small podcast, you know? But I think it's just a testament to the fact that these stories exist and they deserve to be, you know, elevated and have a platform to really speak about that. So it started off from this like social media Instagram project, and as we were like building Juice, I said to Nidhi, I was like, dude, like everyone has podcasts for when they're successful. They're like, oh, how I built this by like Guy Raz. It's like all of us in the entrepreneur space, I feel like I've heard about that podcast. And it's like when people have exited or they're super successful. But I said to her, like, what about like now? What about like the people now who are doing stuff? And so, you know, we just saw that need and we're like, all right, let's just give it a try and see what happens.
That's great. Even though you just spoiled it for me, because I did DVR the TBT
Yeah.
round, and so now I already know who won.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
unfortunately, a little spoiler for me. Hopefully, maybe we'll, hopefully it didn't spoil for anybody else. But at the same time, though, like I really love that conversation. Exposed me to a whole world I didn't know. Like I'm a big basketball
Yeah.
community. So that's great that you're helping to elevate those voices and the kind of impact that they're making while you're also making the kind of impact that you
Yeah.
are with juice and
Thank you.
chai not latte. Or sorry, chai not chai
Yeah,
latte.
yeah, yeah. I love it. Thanks.
Which I swear, like when I saw the time, I didn't understand it either.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm not a big coffee drinker, tea
Yeah.
drinker, so like now if I do order something, I'm not gonna look like
Yeah,
an
yeah, yeah. Be
asshole on
cool, be
here.
cool. Just be like, just a chai, please, you know? You can get your oat milk in there. That's cool. But like don't just yeah, don't say chai tea.
But thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think, not only myself, but I think our audience really took away a lot from our conversation. And honestly, I had lots of other questions I wanted to ask you, so we might further this conversation down
Sounds
further
good.
time, especially as you all continue to grow and learn more lessons. But
Yeah.
again, I think you all are doing some great work. And if you haven't signed up, make sure I'm gonna have in our show notes and everything links to be able to get to your webpage. So make sure you get the app and it's a wait list too, right? So I tried to sign up myself. You get on a wait list to get signed up for
Yeah, so right now we're primarily working with businesses across New York City and like we're giving them like a business software to manage their day-to-day. So we do their bookings, their transactions, their taxes, and we take care of that. And then right now we're like fundraising to be able to build this consumer side that will pair everyone together. So that's how you access these businesses and actually are able to get recommendations from Juice.
Wonderful. So yeah, make sure, like I said, the link is in our show notes. Make sure you check that out. Make sure you get signed up on the wait list. Again, Siri, thank you so much for being part of my.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's been awesome to speak with you, and you've been an excellent host as someone who hosts often. Like you are amazing at what you do, and thank you so much again.
Oh, thank you. And for you out there, until our next entrepreneur struggle conversation, stay healthy. Well, stay safe and stay healthy.